I've always loved snowstorms. There's something magical about the way the world transforms, the silence that falls as if the snow muffles every sound. But that love ended last winter during a blizzard that changed my life forever. It started with a work trip to visit a remote cabin my boss had rented for a team retreat. A storm was forecast, but it wasn't supposed to hit until late that night. I figured I'd be able to make it before the roads became impossible. I kissed my wife and son goodbye, promising I'd check in as soon as I arrived. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the snow had started falling harder. Flurries turned into thick, relentless sheets, and the road signs disappeared beneath a layer of white. The GPS insisted the cabin was only 3 miles ahead, but the storm made progress slow. I squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the road in the dimming light. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the side of the road, waving frantically. It was a woman, bundled up in a heavy coat, her face pale and panicked. Her car must have broken down. I couldn't just leave her out there to freeze. Pulling over, I rolled down the window. "Do you need help?" I called out. Her lips moved, but her words were lost in the howling wind. She pointed down the road, her gloved hand trembling. I gestured for her to get in, and she climbed into the passenger seat, shivering violently. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need to get home." Her words didn't sit right with me. Why would she be out here walking alone in a storm like this? But I brushed off my unease. Maybe her car really had broken down, and she was too shaken to explain. "Where do you live?" I asked. She pointed ahead. "Just keep driving. I'll tell you when to stop." The road was barely visible now, and I drove slowly, my tires slipping on the icy surface. Every so often, I glanced at her. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her coat looked old, outdated like something from another era. And her hair, it was soaking wet, dripping onto her shoulders, even though she hadn't been outside long enough for that. I tried to make conversation to ease the tension. "What were you doing out here in this storm?" "I needed to find someone," she said softly. "Find someone? Who?" She turned to me, and for the first time I saw her face clearly. Her eyes were sunken, and her skin was ashen, almost translucent. "You..." A chill that had nothing to do with the snowstorm ran down my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road. "What do you mean?" "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a mix of sorrow and anger. "Turn around. Leave now." The car skidded, and I slammed on the brakes. When I looked at the passenger seat, she was gone. I stared, my heart pounding. The door hadn't opened. There were no footprints in the snow outside. She had simply vanished. Before I could process what had just happened, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving me in total darkness. The storm howled around me, and the temperature inside the car plummeted. Then I saw the figure again, standing in front of the car, illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. She was closer now, her face pressed against the windshield, her eyes locked onto mine. "You didn't listen," she hissed, her voice echoing in my head. "You should have left." Panicked, I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The figure began to move, circling the car, her hand dragging along the glass with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. I could see her breath fogging up the windows, though my own breath barely stirred in the freezing air. Desperate, I opened the door and ran. The snow swallowed my footsteps instantly, and the wind clawed at my face. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from her. Her voice followed me, carried on the wind. "You can't escape. You're mine now." I stumbled, falling into the snow, and when I looked up, she was there, standing over me. Her face was no longer human, her features distorted, her eyes like black voids. She reached out, and her hand was ice cold as it clamped around my wrist. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. A group of hikers had found me unconscious, buried in the snow. They said I'd been miles from the road, with no explanation for how I'd gotten there. My car was never found. I haven't told anyone what really happened that night. But sometimes, when the snow starts to fall, I hear her voice again, whispering my name, and I know she's still out there, waiting for me to return. I've never feared snow before. Growing up in the Midwest, snowstorms were a regular part of life. I used to love the way fresh snow would blanket the world, turning everything into a quiet, untouched wonderland. But after that night, snow only reminds me of how terrifying silence and isolation can be. It started with a weather alert on my phone. The forecast called for a snowstorm, nothing unusual for December. My cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was meant to be my escape from the chaos of city life, the perfect spot to ride out a storm. By the time night fell, the snow was coming down in thick sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing outside. I had a fire going, a cup of coffee in my hands, and a stack of books to keep me company. The world outside was pure white, but inside, I felt safe. Or so I thought. Around 10 p.m., the power cut out. Again, nothing unusual. I grabbed my flashlight and lit a few candles, relishing the ambience. But as the wind battered the cabin and the temperature began to drop, I started to feel uneasy. I chalked it up to the isolation. No neighbors for miles, no cell service. Just me, the snow, and the endless expanse of trees. I tried to distract myself with a book, but I kept hearing noises outside, soft crunching, like footsteps in the snow. At first, I told myself it was just the wind knocking branches loose, maybe some wildlife. But the sound was deliberate, steady, like someone pacing. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitantly moved to the window. I couldn't see more than a few feet past the glass. The whiteout was so thick it seemed to swallow my beam of light. But then, for just a second, I saw something move, a shadow, human-shaped. "Hello!" I called out, instantly regretting it. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the storm. No response, just the wind. I locked the door and checked all the windows, suddenly hyper-aware of how flimsy the cabin felt. A fortress against nature, maybe, but not against whatever was out there. The pacing outside continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. The sound seemed to circle the cabin, and every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of that shadow darting between the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the storm playing games with my eyes. But then came the knocking. Started softly, like someone tapping on the back door. I froze, my breath visible in the cold air. The fire was dying, and the shadows in the cabin seemed to grow darker. The knocking came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate knocks, then silence. I crept to the back door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Who's there?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear over the wind. That's when I realized the pacing sound had stopped. The snowstorm had swallowed every noise except the thundering of my heartbeat. Then the knock came again. But this time it wasn't at the back door. It was at the window directly behind me. I spun around, and my flashlight beam caught someone. A face pressed against the glass, pale and featureless, with dark, hollow eyes. The breath left my lungs as I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. When I scrambled to pick it up and aimed it at the window again, the face was gone, just snow streaking the glass. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking. Minutes? Hours? I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The knocking returned, faster now, coming from all around the cabin. Every wall, every window. It was everywhere at once. My pulse raced as I backed into the center of the room, clutching a fire poker like it would do me any good. Then came the whispers, low and garbled, like voices carried on the wind. They weren't coming from outside, they were inside. "Leave." The word was faint but unmistakable. It sounded like it came from right behind me. I spun around, swinging the fire poker wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty cabin, the dying fire, and the howling storm. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling the room until I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to get out, But the moment I touched the handle, the whispers stopped. Silence. I hesitated, listening. And then, just outside the door, I heard it. The crunch of footsteps. I threw the door open, expecting to confront something. But there was nothing there. Just the blinding white of the storm, except for the footprints. Dozens of them circling the cabin in the snow. And they weren't leading away. They were leading inside. I slammed the door and bolted it, my chest heaving. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the knocking came again, harder this time. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. When I woke up, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the world outside was pristine, untouched. But the footprints were still there. And when I looked at the back door, I saw it. A single word carved into the wood, deep and jagged. Stay.